Okay, so this is your Science 10 Genetics Unit 1, Genetics, Section 1.2. So we're now done with 1.1, which was on protein synthesis and DNA, and we are moving on to Section 1.2. So this is the first part to that. So just as a refresher, this is kind of the overview of the unit. We are focusing on simple patterns of inheritance. And here is just an overview of your assigned readings for the section. Feel free to pause and read through the next few slides. These readings are also available and are probably easier to read within your note package. So this is page 21 and 22. Okay, to start off as an overview of family traits and how they are inherited, we're going to talk about pedigrees, which are a visual tool that we can look at when considering how traits are passed down a family line. So the proper definition here is a pedigree is a graphic representation of how a trait is passed from parents to offspring. So these look quite similar to when you think about like a family tree. However, we look at a bit more detail with these, focusing on a specific genetic trait that is passed down or present within a family. This is going to look a little bit weird, but we're going to break this down a little bit in the next slide. But each of these symbols represents something different. So I'll pop back to this after, but this is just a general overview of what a pedigree looks like. So a few tips for making pedigrees. So these are a few things that you should know when reading and drawing pedigrees. As we saw in the last slide, there are a lot of different symbols present, and so you're required to know what each of these symbols actually tells you. Circles are for females, so that was what we saw in the last slide. Squares represent biological males. Horizontal lines connecting a male and female represent a marriage. So to give you an example, something like that. So you can see that there's a horizontal line going between a square and a circle, so male and female. Vertical lines and brackets connect parent to offspring. So what that looks like is, so my female and male connected. We do a vertical line coming down to represent the fact that they've had a child. And if they've had multiple children, we then want to make, so they've had one child, and then they've had another child. So they've had a total of 3 children. So notice that it's a vertical line represents the fact that they have had offspring. And then if there are multiple offspring, we would connect that with a horizontal line kind of connecting to the rest. But notice that the horizontal line is not in between like it is here. If it's in between the two, it means a marriage. If it's above like that, coming down, it represents offspring. So point 5 here, a shaded circle or square indicates that a person has a particular trait. For example, here, if our individual had a trait, it would be shaded in like this. So a shaded circle or square, so in this case it's a circle, so the female has this particular trait, and has is usually has. So sometimes we don't actually know for sure. It could be a prediction. So just be aware that this is what that shows. So has the trait or usually has the trait. So a circle or square that is not shaded, as you saw in the last kind of image that I drew, represents an individual who does not have the trait. So for example, if you were considering a trait for blue eyes, that trait would be shaded in. So whoever has the blue eyes would be shaded. And then any other eye color, so brown, green, gray, etc., you would not shade those in because the trait that we are focusing on is the trait for blue eyes. Important for the purpose of Science 10, the target trait will always be shaded in, which may be dominant or recessive. So we'll get into dominant versus recessive later, but this is a good thing to know. Whatever the trait is that you were focusing on, that will be shaded. So Roman numerals are used to indicate the generation. And then the numbers, so the regular Arabic numbers like 1, 2, 3, etc., these are used to represent individuals. So what does that mean? So Roman numerals are these. So these are in order from 1 to 5. And then numbers refers to 1, 2, 3, so on. Okay? So notice the difference between those. Both mean the number 1. However, one is in Roman numerals, one is in Arabic. The last part of the pedigree, like I said, is generations. So for example, if your grandparents are generation 1, we would use the Roman numeral 1 to represent that. If your parents would then be Roman numeral 2, and you and your siblings would be Roman numeral 3. And then to represent your individuals within a generation, so for example, you versus your siblings, it would be using regular Arabic numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc. So I'm just going to pop back a couple of slides here. Okay, so looking, for example, at the original pedigree that you were shown, this would be the first generation, and that's a Roman numeral 1, either represented by a single line or an I. Second generation is that second row, so this entire row here. This would be generation 2. And then the children at the bottom, so there's only 2 males, would be the third generation. And so on if you had a longer family tree. When numbering individuals, we go from left to right. So this is individual 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so now let's try an example together. So label a female with the trait. So which female has the trait? So we can look at the bottom here, and we have a legend that tells us. So affected male and affected female means that those individuals have the traits. If we're looking at an affected female, so this is the female with the trait, and there you should then be able to locate a second female with the trait. A male with the trait, so use that same thing that I just did, use the legend at the bottom, identify the male with the trait. Where is the oldest generation? So remembering that our generations are listed on the side here, and these numbers represent the individuals. How many children did individual 1 and 2 have? And now you want to be careful with this because there are multiple 1 and 2s and you're not told which generation it's in. However, only one set had children. And then it's also good to know, as I kind of mentioned before, with the individual numbers going across horizontally, notice that it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's always going from left to right, smallest to biggest. Okay, so I would like you to try the rest of this on your own. Message me if you have any troubles with this at all. I will try and post a key to this in the next couple of days. And this is on page 26 in your notes. Sorry, I missed this. How many generations does this pedigree show? So again, try these out on your own. All right, so let's work through one more example. So I'm going to have you now work through and draw this. So we are considering a gene for a cleft chin. So make a pedigree chart for the following couple. Dana has a cleft chin. Her husband, Jeff, does not. They have 2 boys with a cleft chin and 2 girls without cleft chins. Hint here, cleft chin is the target trait. So sometimes in these questions, it will talk about multiple things. So you do need to try and decipher what are we actually considering here. So what I would like you to do is pause for a second I would like you to draw your pedigree. So again, using those symbols that we saw, you need to consider that if something is colored in versus not colored in, what does that mean? Which one has the affected trait, which one does not? And make sure you label your individuals as well as your generations, okay? Oh, and to give you a bit of background, a cleft chin basically means that you have, in the center of your chin, there's a vertical indentation in the middle portion of it. So again, pause here, try it out. So off to the side here on the right, I have included my legend. Notice I've got colored in means cleft chin. So we always want the affected trait to be colored in. And not colored in means that they do not have the trait. So I have two parents. Dana has the cleft chin. So the female, which we represent in a circle, has the cleft chin. So this is individual 1 in generation 1. And then Jeff would be individual 2, and this is just based on left to right. And then we're looking at their children. The two boys, represented by squares, are affected by this trait. The two girls are not. So individual 1 and 2 are affected, 3 and 4 are not. And then I've labeled that Jeff and Dana are generation 1, and their kids are generation 2. So check over your answers, make any corrections, and make sure you've got everything down correctly. So here are some examples of human traits that could be included in a pedigree or studied using genetics. So we have many different traits that we could represent using a pedigree. So for example, widow's peak versus not having a widow's peak. So a widow's peak is where the hairline grows kind of lower down into the forehead into a really strong point. Being able to roll your tongue or curl it or not. The length of the second toe. If your little finger or your pinky finger is straight versus crooked. Connected earlobes versus not. Whether or not you have the Darwin's point or not. And then the front teeth close together versus with a definite gap. Now, this is something you want to be aware of, that obviously with braces, etc., these things can be cosmetically fixed. You may not actually see them, but if you were to just let your teeth be the way they are, this is where you would have that definite gap versus not. So what I would like you to do now is take a moment, see, can you come up with your own traits that can be passed down the family line? Actually, in addition to that, I would also like you to research some other inherited human traits and then write these in your notes. So our last thing for this video is essentially to watch through the Amoeba Sisters video, which I have linked here, as well as in the schedule on our Teams page. So take a peek at that, and then this is the end of section 1.2. Part 1, we'll get into that last kind of comment there where we use 2 genes per individual presented as letters. Capital T versus capital T versus little t. So this is to do with dominance and recessive. So we will get into that in our next lesson.